Hello, beloveds, and welcome to Christian Emotional Recovery, a podcast for those who are survivors of childhood trauma, emotional neglect, and narcissistic abuse. This podcast is hosted by Rachel Leroy, a college professor and trauma survivor. Many of us spend years trying to heal and don't get anywhere. We don't always target the trauma itself, which is so often what keeps us stuck. This podcast is where faith meets science. Rachel is an emotional healing expert with 20 years of experience applying healing modalities that helped her start making progress after nothing else worked. She'll show you how to do the same. Each week, we'll cover a topic that will show you how to heal trauma for good. Please check out our website and show notes at ChristianEmotionalRecovery.com and join the Facebook community, Trauma Survivors Unite, Christian Emotional Recovery.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Christian Emotional Recovery. I'm your host, Rachel Leroy, and this is episode 5, season 5 of Christian Emotional Recovery. So we're moving right along, and we're getting close to the middle of the year. It's hard to believe, isn't it? And I said there would be about 10 episodes this year, give or take. So we're going along to the 5th one, so that kind of tracks with where the goal was. And so I just wanted to tell you a little bit about things going on in the podcast, and then we'll jump right into the episode. This episode, season 5, episode 5, is The Cycle Ends With You, Breaking Generational Trauma. The Cycle Ends With You, Breaking Generational Trauma. Now, this episode, we'll get into the details of it in just a minute. But first, let's talk a little bit about the podcast, and we'll jump right in after that. Not too long with this. So just keep in mind that if you're interested, there is a Facebook group. The Facebook group is called Christian Emotional Recovery, Trauma Survivors Unite. So it's the same name as the podcast. Also, if you go there, there are weekly memes, there is support, people ask questions, people share with one another, so there's a community in the Facebook group. Also, keep in mind that there's a YouTube channel, and the YouTube channel includes material that is unique to the YouTube channel. There's a little overlap between the YouTube channel and the podcast, but there's a lot of unique material there as well. Now, I've been busy this year, still looking for that job. It's a tough market right now. I'm just going to keep on, but I've been taking my extra time to do that. And so I haven't been able to work on the YouTube channel much this year, and I will when I get a chance. I'm hoping to put some stuff out, at least a few episodes this year, and hopefully increase it again in the future if I can find that happy medium of finding the right work-life balance and all of that, and or the right finances. So what I'm doing is I put the podcast in the YouTube as well, so you can get it there, and you can also get it on the regular YouTube site, which is ChristianEmotionalRecovery.com, ChristianEmotionalRecovery.com. All of this is in the show notes. Also, keep in mind that the YouTube link is in the show notes, and the Facebook group is also in the show notes. If you would like to support the platform and support the work that I'm doing, I have links to Patreon, Ko-Fi, and PayPal, where you can make a monthly donation of any amount, or you can make a one-time donation. Any donation you make is appreciated, and it goes right back into the expenses of the podcast, which that's about $200 a month, give or take, with all the different platforms and software and different things that I need to run the podcast. Also, check out RachelLeroy.com. That's RachelLeroy.com, where there's more about the podcast and what I do, if you're interested. And just check those out when you get a chance. One last thing, I'm going to be working on a membership site. And that's one reason that I've cut back on the podcast, because I want to try to do something that's more involved, where there's more community, where it can get there's more options away from Facebook. Also, Facebook has gotten to be a very toxic space. So I'm going to keep the group, but I'm also going to have a more involved community in another site. I haven't decided where, but some kind of monthly subscription. It will be affordable. Some of these subscriptions I've heard people have like for $300 a month. It won't be anything like that. But I'm going to do some kind of like maybe a monthly webinar or something and put out some new materials that is exclusive to the membership site, and also put out some kind of, like I said, do some kind of community discussion that's more involved there. So a safe space away from Facebook and Mighty Networks or something like that, I'm not sure, or I may use my Podia site where I already have the website, but I'm just going to do some experimenting and see. But I'll let you know as that comes to fruition, and that'll be later sometime this year that I get that going, or that I have that almost ready to get going. So it'll still be a few months, and I'll let you know, and I'll probably take a survey to see what people want, how many people are interested, what price ranges work for people, and stuff like that. So I'll let you know more about that as that comes up. So let's go ahead and jump right into the episode. The Cycle Ends With You, Breaking Generational Trauma, Season 5, Episode 5. So this episode, we're going to talk about what is generational trauma and how does it manifest, what are the impacts of generational trauma, including in epigenetics, in other words, how trauma lives in our cells and DNA and how to heal them. So you're probably wondering, what is epigenetics? We're going to talk about that. The cultural impact of generational trauma, biblical examples of breaking family strongholds, and scriptures that discuss directly or indirectly breaking generational trauma and curses. And then, because this is what this podcast is all about, we do the scientific approach, we do concrete practices to heal trauma. We're going to talk about concrete practices for breaking generational trauma, okay? Concrete practices for breaking those cycles. So let's go ahead and jump straight in. Now, this episode is more scientifically based and more research based than some that I do. So I have 4 articles that I'm using as sources. So I'm going to read off of those some as we go along. So bear with me. And this episode might be a little long because I really want to get into the nitty gritty of what is generational trauma. I want to show you the science behind how it can get. This is part of how trauma gets stuck in our bodies, but it can happen on an intergenerational level, which means among a whole cycle with different families, passing it down from generation to generation. So the first thing, what is generational trauma and how does it manifest? There's an article in Psychology Today, and it's written by Elizabeth Dixon. She has a license in social work and also some kind of counseling degree, I think CP. Elizabeth Dixon, and the article is called Breaking the Chains of Generational Trauma. We don't have to pass down everything we inherit. And this just talks a little bit about what generational trauma is. And a lot of it, one of the interesting things, and we'll talk about this a little more when we get into epigenetics. We'll talk about what epigenetics is and all of that and the science behind it. But one thing that it talks about is all the eggs a woman will carry form in her ovaries while she is a fetus in her mother's womb. Think about that. That is fascinating. In other words, when your mother was in your grandmother's womb, she carried at that time the egg that would eventually become you, or half of you, and your father's sperm was the other half, and it came together. You know all that stuff, I hope, if you're an adult. But that means that part of you, your mother, and your grandmother all shared the same biological environment. So in a sense, you were exposed to the emotions and experiences of your grandmother even before you were conceived. That's fascinating. But it also means that kind of tone or experience or underlying energy that your grandmother experienced when she was 15 or 20 or 30 years old, however old she was when she conceived your mother with your grandfather, that has an influence on who you are now to some degree. That's mind-boggling, right? So we don't just inherit our looks and our race and our size and all of that from our parents and from our previous generations, but we also inherit our culture and just the energy that a family has. And keep in mind that generational trauma isn't just about like cultural upheavals. That is part of it, like the Holocaust and the Trail of Tears and all of these horrible things, oppressive things that have happened to people over the generations. The Irish potato famine, the Civil War and slavery and civil rights and Jim Crow, all of that affects you if you have ancestors that were impacted by that. But it's also about narcissistic abuse. It's about patterns in families that maybe is alcoholism, addiction, struggling with mental health issues and mental illnesses that might be hereditary or environmental, and the list goes on. There are family patterns that get passed down through the generations, and some of it is biological and some of it is behavioral. But the Psychology Today article talks about generational trauma, and it calls it transgenerational trauma, and it says it refers to a type of trauma that does not end with the individual. Instead, it lingers and gnaws through one generation to the next. I don't like that word, but anyway. Families with a history of unresolved trauma, depression, anxiety, and addiction may continue to pass maladaptive coping strategies and distrustful views of life on to future generations. In this way, one can repeat the same patterns and attitudes of former generations regardless of whether they are healthy or not. Keep in mind that that can also be healthy and positive generational patterns as well. So it's not all negative. And then transgenerational trauma isn't just something that can be easily pinpointed. It is often covert, undefined, subtle, surfacing through family patterns and forms of hypervigilance, mistrust, anxiety, depression, issues with self-esteem, and other negative coping strategies. We also know that it can have a significant effect on the immune system and may contribute to generational curse of autoimmune diseases and other chronic illnesses. Now, the Bible talks a lot about breaking generational curses, and I believe that there's a direct connection here because even Jesus, when he healed people, like the woman with the issue of blood, there was probably something chronic there. The blind man, even the parents said, what did we do wrong? Did we sin? So not every issue is necessarily because of the parents. If you have a chronic condition, it could be because of your family, but sometimes it just happens too. And so like with the guy that had the blindness that Jesus healed, his family was like, did we do something wrong? And Jesus was like, no, that sometimes life just happens. So keep in mind that there's two sides to this as well. And it just continues to go into that, talks about epigenetics and all of that. And we'll talk more about epigenetics later. And then we'll also talk about, since trauma can be transmitted intergenerationally, so can resilience. And we're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about how you can learn it in order to pass it down to future generations. And whether you have children or not, that does get passed down to the people that you impact, biologically or otherwise. So if you don't have children, don't think that it doesn't matter, because you matter. You matter. You're changing it for you. And if you don't have children, also keep in mind that you can pass it down to the younger generation through nieces and nephews, through whether you're a teacher, the people you influence, just the people you're around day to day. So that's some things to keep in mind. Now, a little bit of more of a scientific approach in more detail about generational trauma and what it is. There's an article in Capital Choice Counseling, Generational Trauma, Attachment, and Spiritual Religious Interventions. So I got this one because I thought it was an interesting angle in the topic. And this is also a scientific article, and it's published in Faculty of Human Sciences, St. Paul University. I won't go into all of that, but it's published in the Journal of Loss and Trauma, and it's written by Marilyn Dowsett, Martin Rovers, and they are from Capital Choice Counseling Group. And they talk a lot about, they go into detail about what trauma is, what generational trauma is. And it says trauma, psychological trauma, may be defined and comprehended as the effects of overwhelmingly and extraordinary experiences that leave their victims in a state of helplessness and thereby undermine their sense of personal efficacy or control, their relational capacity, and their ability to psychologically integrate the upheavals of life in meaningful ways. In other words, it's hard to adapt. And traumatic experiences can have a lot of different symptoms, it says. And then in the next section, it talks about generational trauma specifically. And it says generational trauma may be defined as a secondary form of trauma that results from the transfer of traumatic experiences from parents to their children. And it gives studies that back this up. So there is science. I'm not making this up. This is not woo-woo nonsense. There is specific DNA, biological, psychological, and scientific data that shows this. And then it says this form of trauma is also referred to as intergenerational, transgenerational, or secondary trauma. Generational trauma can result from any number of different types of disturbing incidences or experiences. And then it just goes on and on. It talks about war and oppressive situations that people might experience. But like I said, it doesn't have to be war. It could be other family patterns that have been passed through the generations. Okay, so it's a combination of things. And it's also, there's a lot of empirical studies that have substantiated the existence of generational trauma, and the investigations have demonstrated that the post-war effects of war-related trauma, for example, in the lives of combat veterans and prisoners of war, have had a negative impact on family well-being due to a disruption in familial patterns of interaction engendered by post-war traumatic symptoms in the lives of survivor fathers. So we talked about how it's passed down through mothers. That's one way it's passed down through fathers. So generational transmission of trauma, it says a primary focus of the study of generational trauma has been to discover the processes by which parental trauma may be passed down to the next generation. 4 basic psychological pathways of trauma transmission can be categorized as follows. This is still capital choice counseling. The vicarious identification of children with their parents suffering at similar stages of chronological development. In other words, similar experiences at a similar age. The intuitive responsibility assumed by children to compensate in various ways for their parents' suffering. In other words, how you feel responsible even if your parents, like whether they're doing something on purpose, if you don't get what you need, you feel like there's something, instead of there's something wrong with my circumstances, there's something wrong with me. Okay? This isn't about blaming parents, but that's how we operate. That's just the nature of children. The particular patterns of parenting demonstrated by survivors towards their offspring. And the 4th one, the style of communication between parents and their children concerning traumatic experiences the parents have had endured. Okay, so those are the different pathways of transference, as it's called. That just gives you a basic definition of generational trauma, what it is, and how it manifests. Okay, so that gives you a little bit about it, and it also affects attachment. In other words, relationships, how you interact with other people, whether or not you're able to connect with other people. It impacts that deeply. The article talks, like I said, about attachment and how attachment theory. I have another episode that's about attachment theory, and the different attachment styles, and how trauma plays a role in those as we form into adults and even beyond adulthood based on our experiences. And attachment theory provides, it says, a conceptual framework by which types of trauma transmission may be comprehended. An attachment theory perspective, which can accommodate both psychodynamic and family system perspectives, offers an appropriate framework from which to examine the phenomenon of generational trauma. So, translated into English, it's basically saying that attachment is a great framework to help you to understand how generational trauma gets passed from one generation to the next. Okay, so that's just a little bit of basics about trauma and how it works generationally. Okay, now what are the impacts of generational trauma? There's no way to go into all of this into detail, so I'm just going to go over a few things. There's an article in Health. It's just Health magazine, I guess, and it's What is Generational Trauma? What is Generational Trauma? And this is by Claire Gillespie. And it gives you, a basic breakdown of generational trauma as well. And this one talks more about it in a cultural perspective. But some of the impacts of generational trauma are anxiety, depression, heart disease, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And then it talks about how these can have impacts on different groups of people more. And we'll talk about the cultural impacts of it, because I think that's important. I think that your background in this case is relevant, And I'm not trying to get political or anything here. I'm just talking about basic science and how if, for example, you're a person of color, or maybe your gender identity or sexual orientation is different, or maybe you're a woman, or maybe you come from an indigenous background, or you're an immigrant or something like that. There could be, not always, but there could be more issues, that certain disparities and certain things that cause certain generational traumas to be passed down in a unique way. But we'll get back to that. The generational signs and symptoms are a lack of self-worth. This is in health. Anxiety, depersonalization or feeling detached. So we were talking about detachment. Detached from yourself, your surroundings, and other people. Depression, emotional numbness. So that's disassociation. That's one of the trauma coping patterns we've talked about in other episodes. Impaired life skills. Great, huh? That's not fair, but that happens sometimes. Critical thinking, decision making, or managing your time may be things you struggle with. Not always, but you may be hypervigilant in those areas, or you may struggle to even function with those. I know I have, and I can tell you just by working with myself, I have come so far on working on those. So those are skills, even if you're a little further behind than some people, you can learn. And then PTSD symptoms is another symptom of generational trauma. Okay? So a little bit more about the impacts of generational trauma. The first two sections under health talks about that, like I said, and then generational trauma signs and symptoms. We've talked about that a little bit. So let's look a little bit into some other specific areas of life where it's impacted. So one of them is parenting. Parenting, if you're a parent, or if your parents, well, your parents were parents because they had you, but unresolved trauma can lead to reactive or emotional distant parenting. So you may have had a distant parent if they passed that trauma down to you. Or if you're a parent, you have to really, really work to try not to be emotionally distant with your own children. And then parents may struggle with regulation, meeting emotional regulation, leading to inconsistent discipline or emotional unavailability. So it could be that the parents are too harsh and too disciplinarian, or there's not enough boundaries and there's not enough structure and they're too permissive, or there could be even a back and forth between these extremes, or even one parent with each style. That's how my childhood was. I had one parent with each extreme, so there wasn't any real balance. Trauma may cause a parent to repeat cycles of neglect, control, or enmeshment without realizing. Enmeshment is when there's no boundaries, and that's not healthy. That's where you get like Stockholm Syndrome and trauma bonding and no respect for the other person's space. Now, when you have a child, of course, you have to invade their space to kind of teach them things and all that. But as they get older, you give them autonomy and choices as is appropriate for their age, right? In a healthy environment. But there can also be difficulty bonding with children due to fear of repeating past pain or being overwhelmed by triggers. Another impact besides parenting is relationships. The second one is relationships. Trauma can often impact attachment styles. We've already talked about that a couple of times. I will put the attachment styles episode, I can't remember if it's a YouTube or a podcast, but I'll put it in the show notes and use it as one of the sources. So if you want to know more about attachment styles, check out that episode, okay? It's one from a previous season. But trauma passed down through the generations can lead to fear of intimacy, abandonment, or loss of self in relationships, none of which are healthy. And then it can also cause hypervigilance or mistrust, sometimes even paranoia in relationships, making it hard to be able to sustain healthy connections, making it hard to trust people, right? So many trauma survivors are either over-functioning, they're caretaking, people-pleasing, that's where codependency comes in, or under-functioning, withdrawal and avoidance in conflict or emotional closeness. You can also be a codependent and under-function because that tended to be more my relationship style. So personal faith is another one. As Christians, we talk about that on this podcast. And generational trauma can be passed down through religion and in religion and just impact that area of our lives. Our personal faith, our relationship with God, our relationship with the church, and it's all very complicated depending on what your upbringing was. You might have had generational trauma and your faith was a healing presence in your family, or it may have actually been twisted and used against you in a way that was not healthy, or it might have been that those traumas kind of projected onto how your parents taught you faith and taught you about your relationship with God, and you might actually be projecting some of that trauma onto God now. And if you are, that's not your fault. Okay, it's not your fault. But it says trauma may distort how a person sees God, projecting pain from caregivers or authority figures onto their spiritual beliefs. Survivors may feel unworthy, abandoned, or ashamed, believing God is distant or punitive. Faith practices might become performance-based or rigid as a way to seek safety or control, or I would also argue approval. Joyce Meyer talks about that a lot. She talked about her experiences with that. Conversely, trauma can eventually lead to a deeper spiritual healing, especially when faith becomes a source of compassion, safety, and restoration. And I really am not at a place where I feel like I can do this yet, but one of my goals and one thing I feel led that God's telling me to do in the future when I'm able to work through some of my own junk in this area is to create a course on restoring our relationship with God after trauma or through trauma, if that makes sense. So that's a little bit about the impacts of trauma. Now, a subtopic of that is epigenetics. Epigenetics is how trauma lives in our cells and DNA, and we can talk about, it's not just how it's passed down, but it's also if you can pass trauma down through your cells and your DNA, you can also pass healing down through your cells and DNA. So that's beautiful. That's wonderful. That's good to know, right? So there is a section in the health article that talks about what causes generational trauma. That'll go into a little more detail about epigenetics. And I like to do this one because I've got some scientific articles here. This has science in it, but this one is more in layperson's terms. So let's go to the health one and talk about what causes generational trauma. So the article says generational trauma begins when a group collectively experiences a horrific event such as abuse, discrimination, natural disaster, racism, and war. Those events may lead to anxiety, depression, or PTSD among the people directly affected by their effects, those things that were listed, and others. Then those people may pass on their trauma to their offspring, and so on. And the epigenetics comes in when one way that trauma passes down from generations is through epigenetic changes. The theory, and there is a lot of science behind this, and it's becoming more and more obvious, the theory is that trauma changes how your genes work. Then those changes pass down to your children. Now, this is just me riffing off of this article, but one thing that happens is you have genes, and part of your genes are these things, I think they're called telomeres, and the longer they are, the better your genes function and the healthier you are. And trauma gets passed down from generation to generation, makes those telomeres shorter, which impacts the functioning of your genes and your body. And that's one literal physical way that trauma is passed down in the DNA code and the genes themselves and the quality of those genes. So it says, this is back to the article, trauma affects genetic processes leading to traumatic reactivity being heightened in populations who experience a great deal of trauma. And that's by Gayani De Silva, MD, a child and adolescent psychiatrist at Laguna Family Health Center. Okay, so that is a little bit about how epigenetic changes are passed down in DNA. Epigenetic changes, it says, are different than genetic changes, which alter your DNA. DNA is like a set of instructions for your body. So for me, for example, I have red hair and green eyes. When my parents conceived me, my parents had recessive genes that happened to imprint onto me with the red hair and the green eyes. Neither of them have. But I have ancestors on both sides with those. So that's got passed down genetically. That's not the same thing as epigenetically. So DNA is a set of instructions. Genetic changes can change what those instructions say. Now, bear with me. In contrast, epigenetic changes change how your body reads your DNA. It changes how your body reads the DNA, says Health Magazine, known as gene expression. That's where what I was talking about with the telomeres and all that comes in. But epigenetic changes may turn specific genes on or off. People with generational trauma may have certain genes that are not expressed as usual, which increases their risk of certain illnesses like anxiety or depression. And then it says, still, it's hard to pinpoint exactly why certain genes are expressed differently in people who have family members with trauma. Other ways that people inherit trauma from their ancestors is through factors such as discrimination and prejudice. So, and then it talks a little bit more about risk factors. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about the cultural impacts of this as well. So that's a little bit about how epigenetics works. I don't want to go into too much detail, but it is called epigenetics when it passes down not only your DNA, but how it is expressed, how it's expressed. So if you have a tendency towards depression in your family and you have a beautiful, happy childhood that has very little trauma, your tendency towards depression may be lessened or it may never even express itself. But if there is trauma, let's just say there's alcoholism and narcissistic abuse in your family, and you come through a line where maybe one of your family lines were descendants from the Holocaust. So there's probably going to be some extra trauma there, and that's probably going to be passed down epigenetically, if that makes sense. Okay? So that's enough about epigenetics. The cultural impact of generational trauma. I want to read the examples of generational trauma in Health article. I know I'm reading a lot of articles here, but we're going to put all this together in just a little bit. I just want you to understand the cultural, the psychological, and the scientific background of generational trauma, because then you know how, based on your own unique situation, how it impacts you and what you can do to try to change that for the next generation, whether it's for yourself, for your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren, or just for the next generation in general, because it's not all genetic or epigenetic. There is also those other cultural and psychological impacts that can have a positive impact on the next generation, regardless of whether or not you have kids biologically. So examples of generational trauma in Health Magazine, it says historical examples of groups affected by generational trauma include Black Americans, Holocaust survivors, and indigenous communities, among others. Now this is obviously in the United States. If you live in another country, obviously this would apply in other ways. For example, in Africa, you've had genocides. In Eastern Europe, you've had genocides. The people in Ukraine, for example, the people in Gaza, the Holocaust, all of those things impact people no matter what country or continent we're talking about. Maybe drug cartels in South America. The list goes on, but there are ways that people are oppressed by governments, by ethnic groups, by different groups of military people, and so on. I'm not going to go into all that, but all of those things can cause generational trauma culturally. For example, in Black Americans, epigenetic changes have been studied due to chronic stress and nutritional deficiencies of Black Americans during slavery in the United States. And that's led to poor physical and mental health outcomes among some Black Americans. So that's an example that's been passed down from slavery to Jim Crow to the Civil Rights Act and to things that continue to go on today. And sometimes that can contribute to a high risk of depression, anxiety, and high blood pressure among Black Americans. It doesn't mean everybody, but it means just a higher amount of that. Okay, health disparities. Holocaust survivors is another example. And this was studied in the 60s by Vivian Rakoff, who was a psychiatrist, Canadian psychiatrist, and they found high rates of psychological distress among children of people who survived the Holocaust. And it probably passes down to grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so on. But a survey in 2017 of 190 adult children of Holocaust survivors found 18% reported generalized anxiety disorder and 14% depression, 7% PTSD. So that some of it suggested that it was epigenetic, caused by generational trauma among families affected by the Holocaust. And there's another study that talks about a gene called FKBP5 gene, and it talks about how that specific gene was affected epigenetically. Indigenous communities in the United States, but there's indigenous communities in other cultures, such as the Aboriginal communities in Australia. Indigenous communities have experienced generational trauma from the loss of culture, land, and population. Trauma persists, obviously, and that's been passed down in similar ways to African Americans, to Jewish people who are descendants of them. Now, keep in mind, generational trauma, even culturally, is not just people of color, not just people that you might consider minorities in this country or other countries, but there are European cultures that have oppressed other European cultures as well. For example, what happened to the Irish and the Scottish with the English from the Middle Ages onward until about the 19th century. So this can go across a lot of different cultures. And so risk factors culturally, adverse experiences during childhood, discrimination, natural disaster, racism, sexual abuse, and war are some of the cultural impacts and psychological and risk factors for intergenerational trauma. So that lays a good foundation about what generational trauma is, how it's impacting different areas of people's lives, how it's passed down genetically, epigenetically, generationally, psychologically, and the cultural impacts. Now, that doesn't do justice to the cultural impacts, but this is a podcast that's meant to be practical, so I'm not going to get into all the sociology. I'm not an expert. But I've read a lot of sociological data because of being an English teacher and reading literature and stuff, but that gives you a good breakdown of it, okay? Now, and I don't want to bore you with too many hardcore details, even though it's actually pretty interesting and most of us have been impacted in that way, one way or the other, okay? Let's talk a little bit about breaking family strongholds, breaking family curses, and breaking generational trauma. There are so many terms here and they're very similar. Generational curses is not exactly the same thing of generational trauma, but they do go hand in hand. So I want to talk about biblical examples of breaking strongholds. One of those is Joseph, Ruth, and Jesus. Those are some of the ones. Joseph, Ruth, and Jesus. So the Bible gives us powerful examples of individuals who have broke generational patterns and rewrote their family legacies. For example, Joseph came from a lineage marked by deception and favoritism. Remember when he got thrown in the pit? If you're familiar with that story, he was his dad's favorite. His brothers were jealous. They threw him in a pit. They sold him into slavery. They lied and told the dad that he had died, eaten by a lion or something, I forgot. But he chose forgiveness over revenge and broke the cycle of bitterness and betrayal. Now, obviously, he had a lot of junk to work through, and it wasn't just that simple. But that gives you an idea that it can be done. And then Ruth, who was a Moabite widow, walked away from a past of idolatry and loss, choosing faith and loyalty, and stepped into the lineage of redemption. Her husband died, and her mother-in-law said, "Go back to your people." And she's like, "You are my people. Where you go, I will go." That is one of the most beautiful lines in the Bible to me. So there was loyalty and faith. And she became one of Jesus' ancestors when she remarried into the line of Abraham, okay? And she married into this family, sort of that line again, after her husband died without her having any children. And then Jesus himself was born into a broken world and a family line with deep flaws. He broke the ultimate curse of sin and death, offering healing and wholeness to every generation. So if you want a curse breaker, a cycle breaker, and a generational trauma breaker, Jesus is the number one person and entity that did that. He is our Savior for a reason. So each of these stories shows that you are not bound by the pain of the past. You can choose a new legacy. Now, I know we don't do bypassing on this podcast. It's not just simple of, I choose, and that's it. There is an element of choice there, of course, but that's why we talk about all these strategies and validating your issues and understanding where your experience comes from and releasing that stuff out of the body and getting therapy and doing somatic healing and so forth and so on, because that's when you make that choice, you walk it out every day by doing all of that healing work. And then breaking generational and personal cycles. David, Moses, and Mary Magdalene did that. David, Moses, and Mary Magdalene broke personal cycles. The Bible shows us that God uses broken people. I hate that term, but he uses broken people to break destructive patterns. For example, Dave came from a family of overlooked sons and carried forward cycles of dysfunction, yet he was the first to bring worship and intimacy with God to the center of national life in Israel, breaking the pattern through repentance and humility. Moses was born into a people that were enslaved for generations. They carried trauma from abandonment and identity confusion. Remember, they were under Egypt's oppression. So carried trauma from abandonment and identity confusion, but he, Moses, became the one to lead his people out of bondage and into a covenant with God. Mary Magdalene, so this wasn't just men, it was women and men in the Bible. Mary Magdalene, once tormented and cast aside. There's some story of her being a prostitute. That's not fair. There's no evidence that she was ever a prostitute. Even if she was, it still doesn't change the beauty of her story. But it says once she was tormented and cast aside, broke free from a past oppression when Jesus restored her identity. She became the first witness to the resurrection, proving that personal redemption can ripple through history. So each of these lives shows that cycles can end and new stories can begin. So those are biblical examples of breaking family strongholds. That's Joseph, Ruth, Mary Magdalene, Jesus, David, and Moses. Okay? Scriptures that talk about breaking generational trauma and curses. So there are a lot of scriptures that you can use here and you can apply. But if you're working on this issue, I would work on my health physically and mentally and spiritually. I would take a holistic approach. I would learn about generational trauma. I would learn about epigenetics, and I would learn about supplements and exercise and meditation and practices, faith practices, psychological practices, somatic practices, and take a holistic approach in your diet and how you live your life and your mindset and all of that to breaking those generational curses. It's a holistic approach. But part of that holistic approach of healing can also be scriptures, meditating on them, speaking them, journaling them, praying over them, and so forth and so on, soaking on them and all of that. Some of the scriptures, and I'm just going to read each one a couple of times and talk about the theme that it conveys. So there's this whole concept of breaking generational patterns. So Ezekiel 18:20 says, "The one who sins is the one who will die. The child will not share the guilt of the parent, nor will the parent share the guilt of the child." In other words, you're responsible for your own self. So that verse declares that individuals are not doomed to repeat the sins or consequences of previous generations. So that talks about the fact that if that's the case, you can make a different choice and break generational cycles. 2 Corinthians 5:17, "Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. Old things have passed away, and I have made all things new." So trauma may be inherited, but healing and transformation are fully possible in Christ. So the buck stops here. With Christ, you are transformed. You stand on that truth. You live that truth. You holistically work on breaking those generational curses, and Christ makes you a new creation and breaks that curse for the next generation. Freedom from curses and bondage is another theme here. Freedom from curses and bondage. In Galatians 3:13 says, "Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us." So Christ took that generational trauma. He took those generational curses. He took that epigenetics that's passed down to us. He took that oppression that happened in our cultural line, and he redeemed us from that curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. Through Jesus, we are not bound to generational curses. He broke them on our behalf. Now, that doesn't necessarily magically mean there'll be no impacts, but it does mean that we can work through the stuff that came down to us, and that there is a way to heal, and that is partly through Jesus and what he did. Okay? Romans 8:1 and 2. There is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus, because through Christ Jesus, the law of the Spirit who gives life has set you free from the law of sin and death. So freedom from shame, guilt, and generational burdens is part of the promise of salvation. Part of one of the promises of God is that there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. So we are not condemned 7 generations by what our dad and our granddad and our mom and our grandmom and so on did. We are new creations. Another theme here is God's power to heal and restore generations. So this is more direct. God's power to heal and restore generations. For example, in Joel 2:25, I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten. I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten. In other words, God is a restorer. Even when trauma has stolen years of peace, safety, and joy, God will give that back to you. He will return it to you. He will vindicate you. That's part of healing and restoration, even among the generations. Exodus 25 through 6. Exodus 25 through 6, he says, I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. So God will bless your children if you work on healing your own trauma. It's right there. Showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. To me, that all goes hand in hand. A righteous life is about holistic living in a certain way that is healthy, that's healing, whereas trauma and sin and all of that are more associated with each other. Again, I'm not saying if you experience trauma, it's because you've sinned. You might have experienced trauma because of somebody else's sin. That's how oppression happens. That's how narcissistic abuse happens and neglect happens. It's somebody else's sin that is imposed onto you, and you deal with the effects, right? So if that happens, that can also be undone, and blessings can also come down through those generations by right living, and God can make right what has been taken from you. He will restore to you the years that the swarming locusts have eaten. So that's part of the promise and part of the deal of being with God. So while generational consequences are real, God's love and mercy are far more enduring and powerful, is basically what Exodus is talking about there. The last one. Then we'll talk about practices and we'll wrap this up. So Psalm 147:3 says, He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. And that can be trauma. That can be generational trauma. Of course, that applies here. Healing from trauma, generational trauma, is not only possible, it's a promise God offers His people. It's not only possible, it's a promise God offers you as His child. So that is a promise. So if you do the healing work, God will heal you. That's literally what it says. And the very first podcast I ever put out was God will heal your trauma. God will heal your trauma. And that right there is biblical truth that shows that. So we talk about the scientific side, we talk about the scriptural and the faith-based side. Now let's put this all together with specific practices you can do to break generational trauma cycles. They're really not that different than the trauma cycle breaking techniques that we've talked about in general. But it's more with a twist of thinking about it from a generational perspective, okay? So resilience practices, for example. Resilience is literally the opposite of trauma. You overcome and you heal trauma through resistance, through grit, through not giving up, through continuing to do the healing work day after day after day. It's not for the faint of heart. It's not easy. It's tough. But resilience builds those psychological muscles, and it helps us to be able to release the weight of that trauma so that we can be free and lighter and feel better and be healthier. And Psychology Today talks about the transmission not only of trauma, but of resistance and coping with generational trauma. So let's look at that real quick here. Psychological practices in Psychology Today, transmitting resilience. So it says, fortunately, trauma survivors and their descendants can help to reduce the impact of generational trauma of future generations. Just as traumatic experiences can be passed down from one generation to the next, so can the capacity for overcoming trauma and building resistance. For example, Braga et al., that's scientific study, explored how open and loving communication styles between generations helped foster resistance and connectivity. When survivors of trauma openly tell their story and when descendants are able to deal with their parents' traumatic past, new lines of healing of communication open between them. You've heard those stories where they didn't even know that their grandfather had gone through all this stuff, like in World War II or something, and then when they talked about it, it helped heal and it helped to begin this generational healing. You've probably seen documentaries where it talks about the Holocaust and things like that happen and so on, but there's a book called It Didn't Start With You. I think I might have read that book, but it's by Mark Wallen. And here he says it also encourages open dialogue between parents and children regarding the history of family trauma, if that's possible, right? He encourages parents to tell your children the terrible things that happened to you and whatever you know about what happened to your parents and your grandparents. They could be unwitting recipients of painful feelings from the past. When you tell them what tragedies smolder in family history, it can come as a great relief to them, especially if they make the connection that they've been carrying what belongs to you or your parents or grandparents. So that can help to heal when people start talking about this stuff and working through this stuff and working on forgiveness and bringing this out in the light. Bringing what will be in the darkness will come to the light, right? And then working through trauma, if you're a parent, in addition to opening communication with your children or grandchildren about lived experiences, it's important to work through the generational traumas themselves. Trauma survivors can either repeat the cycle or generate a solution by creating a new narrative. This happens when family members speak up and work through hurt, pain, and abuse from the past. So that can be a cultural thing or just a more general family pattern. But children need to believe that they are safe and cared for by trusted adults. When core beliefs are muddled by their parents' mistrust, doubt, resentment, and insecurity, children will learn to view the world in the same way. So that can hinder their ability to form secure and trusting attachments and develop a healthy sense of self-worth. So some tips for breaking the cycle: open up the conversation with your parents about their lived experiences and how they coped, if that's possible. Obviously, use a little discretion there. Notice any embedded patterns, attitudes, or narratives from your family that you continue to portray. Talk through these areas with a trusted friend, family member, or therapist and consider an alternative way of coping or communicating. Cultivate a sense of empathy and compassion for your family and the struggles they endured. Despite their flaws, many of our ancestors worked hard so they could have a better life. This too should be celebrated and embraced. And recreate a new narrative that you want your children or future generations to embody and believe about their family, themselves, and the world. So that's just some general strategies for dealing with generational trauma. And then in that Capital Choice Counseling article is a little more scientific. Coping with generational trauma, resilience, and recovery, it talks about doing this through faith and through faith practices. And so there's a chart here, spiritual and religious coping and trauma. And then it talks about some strategies that you can use. There's a table of spiritual and religious intervening or coping with trauma. A religious resource is pastoral care, intensive listening, deep empathy with suffering, and the healing influence of it is it restores a sense of self-respect, provides comfort and solace, and engenders a sense of secure attachment to God and religious figures of authority in a healthy way. Of course, pick people that are trauma-informed if you go see a pastoral counselor or a minister. I would encourage you, if you're going to talk about any kind of trauma with a pastor, find somebody who's licensed, but definitely trauma-informed. Congregational involvement is another religious practice. Communal worship, social identification, and connection is one advantage of that. Another one is that it provides a sense of belonging. It replaces family losses because sometimes your church becomes your family, and or mitigates relational distress. It makes things better with relationships because you have other relationships that can sort of become that sort of for you. Priestly ministry of religious and spiritual direction. So absolution and forgiveness of perceived relational guilt is one thing that you can do. Emotional relief from feelings of inner torment, and it promotes resolution of grief and mourning. You can do that with a priest or a preacher or a therapist. Any of those you can talk out and forgiveness and stuff and work through that in different ways. There's not just one way to do that. You can even do some of that on your own with journals and through prayer by talking to God. He's listening. He's our high priest. And then theological interpretation of suffering, spiritual instruction and encouragement. So learning about theology and learning about theologies that are biblical and more kindness-based and more faith-based and more grace-based. That can help as well. Provide a means for survivors for spiritually and cognitively reappraising and reaffirming traumatic events and experiences. Now, this article, if you want to know more about how to use Christianity, faith, and faith practices to heal generational trauma, this Capital Choice Counseling is a great resource. So I'll put that in the show notes, and you can read that article in more detail at your leisure if you find that helpful. Okay. Lastly, I'm just going to go through a list of practices, and then we'll close out the podcast. So somatic body practices, psychological practices, and resilience practices. The resilience practice that I talked about was in Psychology Today, has some additional tips, and we talked about those. Those are psychological practices. We talked about religious and spiritual practices, and some of those are the scriptures that I talked about. You can read, write, affirm aloud, journal about, meditate on, and pray about and on the scriptures above and other scriptures. And then read parts of spiritual and religious coping and conclusion in Capital article. That's another thing you can do. You might go through that Capital article and read it to get some more ideas. And then read the chart there especially, because that can give you very specific religious practices and faith practices that can help you heal generational problems. Do what works for you. Do what resonates with you and what you feel God leading you to do. But somatic or body practices is one that I strongly emphasize on this channel. And when I take a holistic approach, I don't exclude one for the other. I believe that all of them can work together as a whole system of healing. Somatic healing, generational trauma, epigenetically involves more than just mental processing. It means restoring safety and regulation to the body as well. And I think it might be good, this is getting really specialized, but maybe we'll talk about epigenetic somatic practices in a YouTube video or a future podcast episode, because there's so much there. And I can't possibly go into all this in this episode. But those body-based practices help interrupt inherited stress patterns and support nervous system healing, which research suggests can influence gene expression over time. If those expressions were turned on, turned off, or altered by traumatic events that happened in your past and in your family's past, then positive healing experiences can also change the expression of those genes epigenetically in the same way. If it goes one way, it goes the other way too. So you can restore some of that and heal some of that. So some somatic practices. Deep rhythmic breathing. It calms the vagus nerve and signals safety to the body. You might try 4-7-8 breathing. You inhale for 4 counts, you hold for 7 counts, you exhale for 8. So you would do a longer exhale than an inhale, or you might do box breathing, which is 4-4-4-4. But inhale breathing is 4, hold, exhale. Your exhale would be twice as long as your inhale. Why does it help? Because it rewires chronic stress responses passed down through hypervigilant family systems. That's the first one. Number 2 is grounding exercises. And I've got some meditations on the website, and I've got some in Insight Timer, and I still have one that I need to put out, and then I'm going to record some more. But those are grounding exercises. They're body grounding exercises. It reconnects your body to the present moment when trauma has you stuck in the past. And you press your feet to the floor, name 5 things you see, hear, feel, or you hold a heavy object. That's just one way. You can do a body scan meditation. You can do something where you feel every part of your body one step at a time. There's a lot of stuff like that can help. And other things you can do is like splash your face with cold water or go for a walk or something like that. But all those grounding practices calm inherited patterns of disassociated fear. So it reconnects you with your body and with where you are in the present moment. So you're here and you're now. And that's healing as well. Tension release or shaking. It discharges stored trauma energy from the body. Gentle body tremors or intentional shaking for 1 to 2 minutes. Shaking out your hands is something you can do. Holding your shoulders up and then tightening them for a second and then just releasing them all at once. And doing that a few times in a row, it mimics how animals naturally release survival stress, reversing frozen trauma responses. So it's actually been proven, and this is going to sound crazy, but if you're in fight or flight, if you pretend to run and then stop, there's something to that helps calm your nervous system because your body thinks it's gotten away from whatever the source of danger is, almost like a predator. It sounds crazy, but there's actually a lot of science behind practices like that working. Conscious movement is another one that might be dance, walk, stretching, yoga, walking barefooted, stretching slowly. I do a lot of stretching and a lot of walking. That's my main exercise. But I do other things too. Sometimes getting that heart rate up can actually de-stress you, but only under the right circumstances. Make sure that you do it according to where you're at the moment. But it encourages body trust and self-expression, and it moves trauma out of the body and restores a sense of agency lost through generational suppression. Touch-based regulation is another one, and that engages oxytocin and calms the nervous system. You might put one hand on your heart and another on your belly while taking gentle, slow, deep breaths, or gently tap on your collarbones, which is also called emotional freedom technique or tapping. I've talked about EFT a little bit, but look up EFT if you're interested. I've used it, and it's actually very helpful. It releases pent-up stress in certain meridian points in the body. If you don't feel like that's for you, then don't do it. That's fine. I always say this, but use discretion and pray about it, okay? Use discretion and pray about it. Touch-based regulation could also be massage, hugs, getting a hug from somebody that you love, your pet. When I get stressed or lonely, or maybe if somebody says something really cruel to me, I'll go get my cat and I'll just hold her and hear her purr in my ear. And that helps so much. So if you have a pet, it's so healing. And then vocalizing and humming, singing or humming stimulates the vagus nerve and brings calm. Hum softly for a few minutes, sing or chant. Why it helps? Because it restores vibrational regulation in the body, especially healing for those silenced in their families. When I say vibrational, it's more here about the brain actually gives off certain waves. There's different states. There's theta, beta, alpha, and so on. And there's certain ones that calm. And when you go into certain meditations or you do certain kinds of singing or humming, it stimulates that particular frequency in your brain and actually calms your nervous system. So it's not woo-woo. There's actual science behind that as well. Inner child or ancestral work. We've talked a lot about inner child work on this channel, but it can also involve ancestral type work. It brings compassion to inherited pain stored in the body. Sit quietly and place a hand where you feel tension. Ask your body, whose story is this? Whose story is this? Then offer comfort or movement. And there's other practices. Look up inner child or ancestral embodiment work. Again, use discernment. I'm not telling you to use a bunch of weird woo-woo stuff, but inner child work is very powerful, and ancestral work can be too. Okay? Epigenetic trauma often lives in felt sensations, so naming and moving it gently out of the body begins it to release. Okay? So those are 7 practices to heal trauma, intergenerationally, somatically, deep rhythmic breathing, grounding exercises, tension and release or shaking, conscious movement, touch-based regulation, vocalizing or humming, and inner child or ancestral embodiment work. I can't go into detail about all those, but some of those might be another episode or another YouTube video at another time. But that's enough for now. That was a very long and detailed episode. Thank you for following along with me. Like I said, I'm going to be starting a membership site sometime in the next few months. I just have to work that out. It's a lot of work to set something like that up. I need to learn about it. I know something about it, but I need to work on that. And I'll give you more information about that and what it will entail. But I'm going to get your feedback on what you want and see what the overall consensus is on what would be beneficial for you and what I'm able to do with the time that I have. So we've talked about breaking generational trauma. The cycle ends with you. The cycle ends with you breaking generational trauma. This has been episode 5, season 5. We've talked about what generational trauma is, what the impacts are, including epigenetics, biblical examples and scriptures of that, and then practices to break generational trauma cycles. I hope this has been helpful. God bless you. Remember, beloveds, you are fearfully and wonderfully made, and God loves you. Have a great day.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of Christian Emotional Recovery, hosted by Rachel Leroy. For links to this week's resources and to join the discussion, check out this episode's show notes at christianemotionalrecovery.com, where you can also find links to our YouTube channel and Facebook group. Join our email list and get other episodes and resources. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate and review the podcast and tell a friend who may benefit from this message. See you next time. And remember, beloveds, God loves you, and you are fearfully and wonderfully made.